Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to another webinar. My name is Paul Royer. I'm fairly new to the company and I'm excited to have you guys out. We're gonna today talk about Microsoft SQL Server on Linux. First, we'll have the pleasure of hearing from Oliver Nelson. And I feel like for the last couple weeks, he hasn't been able to shut up about this. He's very excited. We've all been pulled into his office at least once for him to show us how awesome it is. So I'm looking forward to see the presentation myself. And then we're also gonna have a demo from Marcelo Nashbar. He's out of Brazil. And so I'm gonna turn it over to Oliver. If during the presentation you have any questions, in your control panel, you should see a little questions box. Feel free to put your questions in there. And at the end, I'll coordinate that with Oliver and we'll get those questions answered for you. So Oliver, if you're ready, go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. So today we're going to be showing you some new tech that we've been working with recently. The main topic is, as mentioned, related to SQL Server on Linux, but we'll also be spending a little time talking about some other interesting technologies along the way. The number of new and innovative techs coming out right now it's almost too much to keep up with. There are mashups of existing tech, cross-platform tools, hybrid application stacks. Recently, we played a bit with Visual Studio for Mac, containerization technologies, cross-platform processor-independent binary execution on the web. The list of things happening right now just goes on and on and on. And all of these fresh new takes on existing products or technologies, which is what most of these really are, they're trying to deal with this very basic problem. Once we've invested in something that works, it's hard to leave it behind and start over. And that's a good thing. If your custom application is making use of many of the cool features that are unique to SQL Server, for instance, even if you want to move to cloud architecture or Linux stack, until now, it just wasn't possible. Now it is. So to give you the big picture, the most important point to take away from this campfire is that we're dealing with the same old SQL Server that you've come to know and love. We'll go over why that's the case in a bit, and we'll get into some of the details. But in the end, nearly the entire product is running from the same code base even that SQL Server for Windows is based on. And this is an unreleased product as of right now. The latest Community Technology Preview, or CTP, version 1.4 is just a few days old. Microsoft has been moving very quickly on this from the standpoint of the way Microsoft normally moves. This was announced towards the beginning of 2016. They went into a private beta with it very early on, and then the CTPs have only been out for the last few months, really, and they've been iterating very quickly on it since then. Many people are actually expecting a release in mid-2017, so really in the next 2-3 months here. Now, I know I just said that we were dealing with the same code base, but there are certain parts of the product that are different, that just aren't there, for instance. It's changing quickly, but most people are assuming that the majority of business intelligence features in SQL Server for Windows aren't going to make it into the Linux release initially, and that those will be added after release. And we'll talk briefly about why that's the case a little bit later. This version works well on Ubuntu and Red Hat, less well on Suse. Suse is newer for them that way, and even less so on Docker. Today, we're going to be showing it on Ubuntu and Docker, and it's good to know that this is not some sort of crummy proprietary hack job or anything like that to make all of this happen. Microsoft is doing things the Linux way. They aren't doing anything weird like requiring custom startup scripts or making you view the entire Linux install as like an appliance sort of architecture at all. Installing and using SQL Server for Linux is not much different from installing something like PostgreSQL on Linux. So before we dig into how this occurred and how this is working, let's first go over why. And most importantly for all of you here today, it's good to know that Mertech is actively testing and supporting SQL Server for Linux. We're testing it not only with our drivers, but also seeing how it fits into the microservice hybrid cloud systems that our customers are building using things like our Thriftly.io server product. So let's go over why this product exists. So if you think about how Microsoft used to do things, releases like this don't really make a whole lot of sense, but we're dealing with a new sort of Microsoft. It used to be that Microsoft would bury really cool or innovative tech like this by forcing Windows platform integration. Think, for instance, about how Office used to only work with SharePoint, another MS product, instead of all of these various cloud providers that are out there, like Dropbox integration, Box.net. There are, all of these various vendors out there that are offering ways of, doing cloud-based file sharing even. But for the longest time, Microsoft would only integrate with SharePoint. Now, Microsoft has realized that their customer base wants and expects their products to work with not only consumer-oriented gear and products, but also the huge and continuously growing world of open source application stacks. So in that way, this product makes Microsoft less rigid. They're more adaptable, they're more flexible. Secondly, Microsoft is more and more facing the battle of IT departments that are just fine with keeping Windows on the front end, but on the back end, they either are transitioning or already have transitioned to an open source Linux stack. Now, database servers are, of course, one of the linchpins of corporate IT systems. So having a way of getting into these shops that already were on a Linux platform, for instance, with a feature-rich database server that runs on their existing Linux infrastructure, makes Microsoft an option where they previously weren't an option. So this extends their reach. And most importantly, the biggest reason for this product is that it answers the Oracle threat. Oracle is in a unique position because they have this enterprise class database server that's available for multiple platforms. And this is something that Oracle knows very well. In recent years, Oracle has gotten more expensive even. They were really the only choice for enterprise class relational database server on Linux. And that's still somewhat true today. You may think to yourself, well, there's PostgreSQL out there, there's MySQL out there. Both of those have enterprise class offerings. And you'd be right about that, but there's some quid pro quo to keep in mind when considering some of those that make Oracle and Microsoft a little bit different. Remember, for instance, that MySQL is now owned by Oracle. Their enterprise pricing is really starting to reflect their ownership now too. And for PostgreSQL, although it has enterprise class features and you can get enterprise support, it doesn't really stand up to some of the feature sets of the big players like Oracle and Microsoft. For instance, PostgreSQL doesn't really have a solution, neither does MySQL in fact, for transparent data encryption or data encryption at rest of the database that is independent of the file system. They don't have solutions for things like data masking. These features are totally missing on PostgreSQL and MySQL. So that's some of the reasons that this was kind of an open space that Microsoft is coming into, and really they're going to fill a need in the market with this product. So now we've looked at the why. Let's see how Microsoft actually made this work. So we're gonna break this down a bit. And we're going through a very simplified version of how this all works. As you might imagine, doing something like what Microsoft has done here without basically creating a whole new product from scratch or a rewrite requires some very interesting and complex technology. It all starts with a technology Microsoft calls Drawbridge. And this was a research project that was announced by Microsoft back in 2011. Basically, Drawbridge enables a sandboxed, customized version of Windows to be loaded into another operating system, like Linux, for instance. Microsoft has made a loadable library version of the entire Windows kernel and Windows API. Now, interestingly, you can load other operating systems in a similar manner using the same technology stack to give you things like Ubuntu running on Windows, but that's a topic for a different webinar. Now, that's part of it. Now we need to shift over to where SQL Server comes into this, and a change specifically that was made back in 2005. Around that time, with the release of SQL Server 2005, Microsoft realized that it was much faster to handle caching, thread scheduling, memory management, and even I/O inside the SQL Server engine rather than relying on what Windows provided at an OS level. And in fact, they had already done a lot of this at that point in time, but what they did for SQL Server 2005 was they rewrote a large portion of that SQL Server engine to talk to what was more or less a specialized operating system built just for SQL Server. Nearly the entire SQL engine is written against this customized OS-like API that Microsoft calls SQL OS. It was a big change. Microsoft did, a lot of their developers actually wrote about this change as well, and it wasn't anything that was secret or anything like that. But because it didn't affect the external interface, a lot of people didn't notice that this had occurred even. So to run SQL Server on Linux then, what Microsoft did was they ported their SQL OS API to run against this Drawbridge technology alongside a library version of Windows. So Windows loaded as a library. Once this entire stack is loaded, the SQL Server engine can be loaded on top of it to provide a full version of SQL Server that's nearly as fast as a native version running on Windows. And notice in the illustration here that essentially there's nothing different between running SQL Server on Windows and running it on Linux for the majority of it. When we look at SQL Server on Windows, of course, we're not using the Drawbridge technology, but otherwise they're identical. The only thing that Microsoft has to do is to disable certain parts of SQL Server that aren't yet working in this Drawbridge technology. But overall, you're running the exact same code base, which means it's not a new product from that standpoint. It's the same product with that same proven track record running on a different platform. So that makes it, when you think about all the validation testing and all of that, of course, they're doing all of that, but they're not having failures when they do those sorts of things because it is the same code base for SQL Server on Linux. So there's one telltale spot when we do our demos where we're going to be able to see this sort of Drawbridge technology, and I'll point it out to you as well. And actually, we're going to get into our demos now. So for our first demo, we're actually going to have Marcelo show using this SQL Server on Linux with our BTR2SQL product, and then afterwards I'll show it working against our Flex2SQL product. So now let's turn it over to Marcelo.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to show something about the BTR2SQL driver working with SQL Server for Linux. For this demonstration, I'm going to use this the demo data database, which comes with a pervasive SQL. And so we have all these tables, and basically I'm going to do some few operations against this depth data file. So I'm going to use here for migration I have the BTR2SQL 5.2. Since there are only a few files, I'm going to select all them and migrate to SQL Server. So they are going to be created now. Everything is there. Here is another screen. I have the Management Studio connected to the SQL Server for Linux, which is, in my case, is running on Ubuntu. And for you, you can see here, I have all the tables migrated now. So you can see them here. Just to make sure I have them in Linux as well. This is the SQL CMD, is a query tool that we can install on Ubuntu as well. Now I have here some old tool which I can use to connect it to SQL Server. Basically, you don't have to do anything. I mean, there is no specific thing that we need to do to get connected to SQL Server on Linux, as long as you have the TCP/IP connection available. So I'm going to connect to the database. This is an old tool I told you guys, and I'm going to browse this depth. Here is the data. For example, I have this last one. I'm going to change that to demo. This has been changed. I'm going to query this, and we can see here it has been changed. I can also show that on Linux, and we are seeing here it has been changed. Now I'm going to do some update, query that again, and we have all these line changes. I can go back to my tool, just to refresh the screen, and I have the record changed. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. As long as you have a SQL Server installed, the DataFlex BTR driver, you'll be able to connect to the database and work as if you have a Windows server. So no problem to work with that. That's all, Oliver.
Yeah, so as you can see, there's, I mean, you know, this is the same sort of simple demo that you know, Mertech did well over a decade ago, nearly going on 2 decades ago, with showing the same sort of thing. There's nothing different. There's nothing special you have to do at all. It just works. And so now I'm going to basically show you some of the same stuff and a couple other combinations in relation to using the SQL Server for Linux with DataFlex in this case. So let's see, you guys should be seeing my screen now. Yeah, it looks like it's up here. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get out of there. And we'll just minimize that. And we're going to start up an Ubuntu virtual machine first. And we're actually going to start from a little bit earlier standpoint than Marcelo showed here. And we're going to show you the installation process even in this case. So I'm just going to start up this machine. And one of the things that absolutely blew me away about this when I was first playing with it is how fast it is. When you consider the installation process of getting SQL Server on Windows, and then you do it here, as we're going to do on Linux here, it's almost unbelievable. So I'm going to go ahead and do the install now. I've already added the repository that Microsoft SQL Server is on onto this machine here. So basically, I just need to do a very basic sudo apt-get install MS SQL Server. And let's do it again. I think something else updating right now. Let's reboot real quick. Here we go. Okay, so the installation process is super easy. You can see the majority of the time we're going to spend on doing the installation here is related to downloading the installer off the web, because this is being pulled down. It's not doing a local copy. So after we go ahead and get it installed, we have to run one other command, and then we will have a working installation. And then what we're going to do is we'll switch over to a Windows virtual machine and do some of the rest from there. Okay, so our installation is done. Now we need to do a little bit of setup. You know, typing passwords during a webinar is just about the hardest thing in the world to do. We'll see if I did it right. Okay, there we go. We have a working installation. And I happen to know the IP address of this machine already. So we're going to go over here to a Windows 10 virtual machine that I already have. This is actually running the very latest version of SQL Server Management Studio. And we're going to connect, that server is running at 212. So we're going to do just an SA login for our demo here. And there we go. We're connected to that SQL server. I mean, that was the entire installation process. It's odd how much faster it is to do it this way than it is to do the same sort of thing on Windows even. So we'll go in and create a test database. And we're going to use our ever-present order entry. And then we will open up Flex2SQL migration utility, and we'll just do a simple migration over there. And we're just going to say to convert these and convert all. And this is all there is to it. From the standpoint of our driver, it's you know, not really much different that way. Like I mentioned, this is pre-release software. It's not perfect yet, but it's actually in really good shape for where we're at right now. So if I were to go in and open up our order entry application, I'll just connect to that one, and I'll pull up a record. And that's it. There's not much else to it. Everything is the same from that standpoint. And it's very, very simple to do. And what Microsoft is doing here is they're allowing a whole bunch of unique technologies to come out right now that allow you to do interesting things that just weren't possible before. So what we're going to do now to kind of demonstrate some of that is we're going to remove the driver prefix. We can go back to the DAT version of these. And we're going to disconnect here, and we will go to our other. We're going to go in and just pause this one, and instead we're going to show you the container version, the Docker version of SQL Server running on Mac. So I'm going to just run this natively on my Mac, and I'm using a tool called Portainer. That kind of makes it a little bit easier to see what we're doing here. So we're going to go ahead and add a container, and we'll call this one SQL Demo. And the image that we're pulling is from Microsoft. Next, and we are going to do a specific port map here on the standard SQL port. We're We're going to make it public, and there are a couple of settings to make this one work that we have to pass to basically configure the container. So first one is to accept the end user license agreement, believe it or not. And the second one is to set a password. So we're going to set our password to that. It requires that you have at least an 8-digit password. Okay, and that's it. So that container was one that the base container was already downloaded on my machine. And so we now have a running SQL Server on my Mac. So, and the way we'll connect to it, my Mac's IP address is a little bit different. Boom, we're connected. It's really that easy. It's super simple to get this stuff up and running. And of course, we'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but we're going to go in here and create a new database. And we are going to call this one order entry again. Just keep it all nice and simple. And we'll go into our migration utility and we'll do a migration to this one. And then we're going to show you something a little different with it. Order entry, select DF tables, convert all. Okay, so now we're going to open up Visual Studio Code. Now, Visual Studio Code, we'll go ahead and minimize some of the rest of this. Visual Studio Code is an open source editor, code editor that Microsoft released that is multi-platform, and our developers just love it. It's basically the editor we're using for most things nowadays. It's a very simple editor, but it has a very rich plugin system to it. And one of the things Microsoft released was a SQL sort of plugin to it. So I'm going to pull up that now, and we're going to open a connection to our order entry. I already have it saved in here. Okay. So basically now I opened a connection to that SQL Server running on my Mac that we just created. And what we're going to do is just a very simple query. And you can see I've got even completion occurring right in my editor here. I'm able to write SQL scripts right in this editor just as if it's a file that I have open here. And so this makes it really useful for when you're developing to be able to prototype code creation right off the bat, SQL creation right inside of your code and run queries. So we have this query, and we're going to now execute it. And there's our data back right out of the order entry example that we ported over from the DataFlex code, the DataFlex stat files there, available right on my Mac in a code editor. This sort of mashup or collaboration of technologies is what's happening right now and is so interesting and makes developing in the way that any single developer feels they need to work an easy thing to do. So let's go back to our slides now. And talk about this in relation to our SQL Server for Linux support from Mertech. So obviously we have a version of both Flex2SQL and BTR2SQL drivers that work against SQL Server for Linux. And it actually didn't take too much to make this happen. It was a pretty simple change. The next question, of course, is when can you start using this and playing with this yourself? Well, it's not quite ready, but we're hoping to have a beta version that will run against the CTPs very soon here. As for a fully supported version that you could use in production, we're going to have to, of course, wait for Microsoft to release the product so we can do full validation testing against it but this is something that we're keeping a very close eye on, and it's something that we're going to support. And this actually leads me to one last item that I wanted to talk about. Normally, SQL Server service packs don't get much attention. And in many ways, SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1 didn't really add much in the way of new features. But what it did instead was much more important. Microsoft has enabled what they refer to as a single programming interface, or surface. Essentially, the entire pricing structure of SQL Server has been revamped so that the product is priced based on scale instead of being priced like it used to be based on scale and features. And this is something that's enabled with a service pack. It's a little bit odd that it wasn't there for 2016 originally, but it is there for Service Pack 1. But this basically means that every edition of SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, including the free editions of SQL Server, now include all of the features that were once limited to enterprise or standard licenses. Just look at this chart. Now, we did an entire campfire about some of the really cool security-related enterprise-only features that are in SQL Server. We spoke at length about how third parties, like companies like Hexatier, are selling products to fill in the feature gap for people that need enterprise features but don't have an enterprise budget to get them. That's all been wiped out with this service pack. Now you can make use of all of these cool features all the way down to, in most cases, the local DB edition of SQL Server. You can see here just about the only things that aren't supported are a couple items in local DB that just aren't practical to support for various reasons, but everything else you get. And if you think about it, you can kind of see how this fits together with some of the items that we spoke about earlier in relation to why Microsoft has created SQL Server for Linux. By having this unified feature set, Microsoft can get a buy-in from some of these small open source shops that can start with SQL Express on Linux, and eventually, if they're successful and their product is a success, they can grow into SQL Server Standard or Enterprise Edition. And essentially, you don't have to make any compromises in your code along the way in relation to these features. If your small application has just as much of a need for row-level security, dynamic data masking, the always encrypted, if you're starting a new application that has certain legal regulations around it where always encrypted would be important, you've got that all the way down into the local DB edition. If you're looking at a cloud or hybrid cloud sort of system, always encrypted could be very important as well. You have all of that all the way down so that even for these small startups, it's possible to use it. This gives Microsoft a really impressive product at the low starting price of free. And of course, this can run on commodity Linux hardware in the cloud. So all of a sudden you have a SQL Server that can be hosted on DigitalOcean or Linode or some of these vendors that have these great low-cost Linux servers that let you get going for very little upfront expense. And it also gives them a way of helping the customers, which there are a ton of these, that have these existing deeply integrated technology stacks that want to transition to a cloud or hybrid cloud tech. And think about the fact that this drawbridge technology that we talked about early on is actually the second implementation of that tech. We already have seen some of the first implementation where you can actually get to Ubuntu directly from your Windows installation. Microsoft is investing very heavily in these sorts of technologies, including things like containerization. And they're doing this to help their customers build microservices, to build cloud-based applications, to move their existing application stacks to the cloud. And that's one of the reasons that we think that this technology fits very well with what Mertech is doing and our Thriftly technology, for instance, and those sorts of things. So really, that's all we wanted to talk about with you this morning, kind of show you some of the, the new stuff and let you know it's something you'll be able to play with very soon. And as you might imagine, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. We're really excited to get into your hands some of this technology so that you can start developing with it. And so look for a newsletter coming soon that's going to announce a beta of Flex2SQL and BTR2SQL. And thank you for taking time out of your day to join us.